Last but not least here with Alzheimer's disease. It's starting on Roman numeral number 5. Some of these institutes around the country, remember, said there were 27 of them. One of the biggest problems we have with Alzheimer's disease has to do with making a diagnosis. Until recently, about the only thing we could do was something called the mini mental state test, asking what's the date, what day of the week is it, what month is it, little paper and pencil test. There was also a test called the clock drawing test, that if somebody can't draw the time of day with just making up a circle and the time, that might be predictive of Alzheimer's disease. But it's been very, very difficult to treat Alzheimer's disease if you can't diagnose it. And so they've tried to do brain studies and stuff, and it was very recently, maybe about 10 years ago, well, maybe that's not so recent, but one of these research centers, a place out in Pittsburgh, identified finally a way that if somebody has Alzheimer's disease, they could stain the brain and actually find these amyloid plaques. Because until recently, the only way to make sure that somebody had Alzheimer's disease was at autopsy. And so the name of the researcher was a gentleman by the name of Klunk. And I think I don't have this in your abstracts yet, but I'm going to add it. Bill Klunk, K-L-U-N-K, did a very famous study where basically they were able to develop a substance, and he called it Pittsburgh Compound B. So it was, I think it was called BIP, but it was a substance out of Pittsburgh that it seemed when given into the brain would stain the brain. And so Klunk found this, and this really helped things out. So it was called, it was by Klunk, if you will, and you can read the abstract and summarize it. But this whole emphasis now in one group of researchers from around the country looking at making diagnosis. And so the people who fund Alzheimer's disease came up with this idea of the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative. Can we actually do a whole bunch of research and try to figure out diagnostic issues? So if you look at this particular thing, they're funding all sorts of things. Can we predict who's going to get it? Can we do MRI studies? Can we look at PET scans? This Pittsburgh substance, Pittsburgh compound P, has seemed to be very useful in the brain. Can we actually look at some other things to predict who's going to get Alzheimer's disease? And that's really part of what's been going on with this. And you can see that with some of these substances and some of these things going on, because if we could just diagnose it better, maybe we'll have a better chance of treating it better. And that's what the ADNI studies are all about, A-D-N-I, if you will. Okay, so in this realm, people look at some of these biomarkers and predictions. If you look on the second page of the outline, there are 3 phases to Alzheimer's disease preclinical. There's a lot of research going on in something called mild cognitive impairment. Have you heard about this? Mild cognitive impairment, where people have little word-finding difficulties. Is this predictive of people getting Alzheimer's disease? The answer is yes, sometimes it is. So there are a lot of people doing this particular research. Phase 2 is where you actually have Alzheimer's disease and you start showing the middle level phases of this. And then finally, when you've got full Alzheimer's disease and you don't remember anything and life is very, very difficult. So this is certainly part of the process here by which people work with to try to understand Alzheimer's disease and what's going on. The Alzheimer's Association many times tries to help families out with a lot of this stuff. The next abstract I put for you was just the idea, once again, of looking at people. Oh, there it is, Pittsburgh Compound B. It's about 15 lines down, and they actually found that they could stain the brain for this Pittsburgh Compound B and know who's going to get Alzheimer's disease, which has really helped out the whole field here. So this is part of the process in trying to predict things. And actually in this study, I got to go into a little more with this study. This study was about what we call the AD8 scale. And if you look on the back page, you can see that's the scale that they currently use to diagnose Alzheimer's disease. What they found is that this scale, the more answers you got wrong on this scale, the more that this Pittsburgh compound P was staining amyloid in your brain, so that this substance, did I say P? I meant B. Pittsburgh compound B was staining the brain. So this is exactly the kind of behavioral marker that you could use to predict Alzheimer's, because it was actually correlated with the amyloid plaques in the brain. So in summary, there's a whole bunch of research going on now in terms of making diagnosis, but hopefully from this presentation, what you have figured out here, and I've tried to water it down, although I know I've covered a lot here, is we started by talking about the psychological implications. When people get Alzheimer's, it really does wreck their lives, and it changes the whole functioning of the family, and it's going to cost a lot of money, and so obviously trying to find a treatment is good. We then went through the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's disease, what's going on inside the brain, the breakdown that's actually occurring. We talked about some of the new and recent research coming out where they go through clinical trials and try to come up with things. A lot of misses. Hopefully in the future we'll have a few more hits. We went over current pharmacological therapy. Doesn't help a whole lot, but it helps somewhat, kind of generation one, if you will. And then we talked about this whole big diagnostic thing of, can we actually look at this Pittsburgh compound B? It will stain the brain. You could do PET scans. You could have biomarkers. In some studies, they've even looked at things like smell. And if people start smelling incorrectly or can't identify things, the smell organ comes in through the nose, right near the amygdala and right near the limbic system, where a lot of these changes occur. So hopefully this makes sense to you. I'd ask you for each one of these presentations to summarize, type up your own story in your own words to show me you understand what we have covered. Thank you all very much. Bye now.